I stepped into the foyer and every conversation thinned like someone had turned down a dial. The chandelier light skated over polished marble, and faces I knew by name, but not by welcome. My father's jaw tightened before his eyes found me and stopped. My stepmother smiled the way people do when they're measuring the damage. My brother stood by a display of the company's new defense interface, looking like a portrait that had finally been framed. I carried a small black clutch with a credential that could open more doors than this house ever did. The scent of gardenias from the staircase clashed with the bite of cold air, drifting off the rain. I hadn't been here in 7 years long enough for the locks to change, and for me to change with them. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever walked into a room that decided who you were before you spoke, tap like and subscribe, so this story finds the next person who needs it. My name is Riley Monroe, and the first lessons I ever learned were patience and kindness at a kitchen table that wobbled unless you tucked a folded napkin under the back leg. My mother, gone too soon, believed in notes for teachers and casseroles for neighbors, the quiet kind of generosity you don't post about. When Dad remarried and the house multiplied into marble and glass, the old napkin trick became a decorator's team, and the meals were plated by staff who moved like a rehearsed ballet. The values didn't grow with the square footage. I kept mine anyway, even when the new version of family measured worth in resumes, photographs, and who could stand closest to my father at a fundraiser. I was a scholarship kid who loved numbers because they didn't flinch under pressure, and I loved code because it behaved if you listened closely to what it was trying to do. School turned into a string of early mornings and long nights, the kind that smell like coffee and printer ink, the kind where you learn that good work rarely announces itself. When I graduated, the path laid out for me had a company logo stamped on every step: Monroe Dynamics, then an MBA, then a corner office with glass on 2 sides. It was polished and certain, and it felt like a borrowed suit. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, thin and official, inviting me into federal service where the debates were not about profit margins, but about keeping people safe in ways most would never see. My father called it a detour that would eventually correct itself, then an experiment, then a mistake. I heard all 3 while packing a suitcase. The night I left this house, I folded my clothes on the bed where I used to study geometry and said thank you to a room that had been mine until it wasn't. I moved into a 1-bedroom over a laundromat that rattled on Thursdays, cooked eggs in a pan that heated unevenly, and memorized security doors that clicked like metronomes. The money was modest and the mission was not, and I learned to carry both without complaint. You can want a simpler life and still choose the heavier one. Federal work for me was never about being important. It was about being exact. The problems arrived without fanfare and demanded answers that didn't care about whose last name was on a building. I learned to track breach patterns like weather, to listen for the way a system coughs before it collapses, to write protocols that could make a bad day survivable. My name didn't appear on press releases. It didn't need to. The reward was knowing a power grid stayed on somewhere, a hospital kept its records, a flight control system did what it was supposed to do. The first time I saw Monroe Dynamics listed on a federal contract summary, the screen glow felt colder than usual. Stonebridge Global had partnered with my father's company on a defense interface that would touch systems too sensitive for shortcuts. I didn't request the assignment. I didn't refuse it either. When the liaison brief arrived with my initials at the top, I took a longer breath than normal and said yes. Work is cleaner when you pretend history doesn't exist. It is better when you acknowledge that it does and do your duty anyway. Coming back to the estate felt like standing between 2 versions of myself, the girl who knew where the light switches were in every hallway and the woman who could shut off a network from 1,000 miles away. The guests were the same families who signed holiday cards with embossed gold lettering and believed their children's futures had been secured at birth. The economic distance between my studio apartment and this ballroom was measured not in dollars, but in how people greeted the staff without remembering their names. I noticed the small things: a waiter with damp cuffs from carrying ice buckets, a florist rearranging stems so the camera would catch the right angle, a security guard whose eyes tracked the room's exits instead of its art. I knew why I was here, and I knew they didn't. That gap settled over the evening like fog. My father's voice, when he finally offered a hello, had the practiced ease of a man who plans outcomes and dislikes surprises. Paula's welcome sounded like a test you're expected to fail. Derek had grown into a version of confidence that mirrors other people back at them. The display in the center of the room showed a polished model of the interface I would audit in a few hours, its clean lines pretending not to carry risk. Quiet tension hummed under the string quartet, under the compliments, under the speeches waiting to be given. I could feel the moment approaching when the room would force me into a role it preferred. Across the marble, Paula stepped out from a conversation, a hostess smile lifting without reaching her eyes, and a server followed 2 steps behind her, balancing a silver tray that glinted under the chandelier. She stopped in front of me, angled her head just so, and slid the tray toward my hands. Paula's hand brushed my arm as she set the silver tray against my palms. "Since you're here," she said lightly, "make yourself useful." The words slid under the music, soft enough for the guests to miss, sharp enough for me not to. The weight of the champagne flutes wasn't much, but the moment carried something heavier. Eyes whispers judgment, dressed up as politeness. I steadied the tray and smiled the kind of smile that doesn't ask permission. Around me, conversation swelled again, polite laughter echoing under the chandelier as if nothing had shifted. I walked the room carefully, the sound of my heels tapping through the noise. Each cluster of guests had their rhythm men talking business in short bursts, women in sequined dresses leaning toward one another with practiced delight. Someone asked for a refill and handed me an empty glass without meeting my eyes. I replaced it quietly and moved on. Across the hall, I caught the faint reflection of myself in the marble column, black dress, neat bun. Nothing remarkable, except that I knew what they didn't. Every person in that room carried an opinion of who I used to be, but not one of them knew why I'd returned. I passed the dining room where 2 of my aunts were seated. They spoke in the low, indulgent tones people use when they believe they're being kind. "At least she looks put together," one said, for someone who walked away from everything. I pretended not to hear the same way I had learned to tune out the hum of gossip years ago. The air smelled of lilies and expensive perfume. It clung to the back of my throat like sugar that wouldn't dissolve. I could feel my father's voice traveling through the crowd long before I saw him, steady, commanding, guiding investors toward the model of Monroe Dynamics' new defense platform that stood at the center of the hall. Derek stood beside it, confident, charming, a future being rehearsed. The last time I had seen this house, I was 24 and leaving before dawn with 2 suitcases and a silence that filled every hallway. My father had stood at the bottom of the staircase and told me I was no longer part of this family if I chose federal service over the business he built. I remembered how the locks changed before I could turn back. That memory flickered at the edge of my mind as I balanced the tray and moved through the present. Every corner of the estate felt smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because I no longer fit inside the version of myself they had built. A man waved me over from the bar. "Miss, I think we're running low here." He lifted his empty flute toward me. His smile was courteous, his tone indifferent. I replaced his drink and stepped away before he could ask another favor. My pulse was steady. This wasn't humiliation. It was observation. Every move I made tonight would tell me more about the people I'd once called family than any report ever could. From across the room, Derek's laugh carried easily. He was mid-story, gesturing toward the scale model, explaining to a cluster of executives how their interface would redefine national infrastructure. The words sounded impressive, the way sales language always does. I knew the truth hiding inside those claims, untested code, missing validations corners cut for speed. What none of them knew yet was that the final authorization for this very partnership rested in my hands. Paula drifted by again, whispering without breaking her smile. "Keep your shoulders back, dear. Try to look like you haven't wasted all that potential." I kept my gaze forward. The crystal glasses on the tray caught the light. Their reflections looked like a field of small fires. I carried them to a group near the terrace doors, exchanged polite nods, and turned as the music shifted into a slower tempo. That's when the room changed. The door near the grand staircase opened, and a man in a tailored gray suit stepped inside. Even before anyone said his name, the energy shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Conversation stilled in fragments. Gregory Monroe's voice brightened as he hurried forward. "Thomas," he said, extending his hand, "we're honored to have you here. Thomas Keating, CEO of Stonebridge Global." The other half of the joint project shook my father's hand with polite efficiency. His eyes swept the room once, then caught mine. Recognition flickered instantly. He moved through the guests, bypassing the investors and executives heading straight toward me. My father continued speaking to empty air before realizing his audience had walked away. Thomas stopped in front of me, his voice even. "Agent Monroe," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to see you here in person." The sound of that title sliced through the music like a clean note. Every conversation nearby faltered. I felt Paula stiffen beside me. My father's expression froze between confusion and disbelief. Thomas extended his hand, not for the tray, but for me to shake. "It's good to finally meet the mind behind the adaptive firewall sequence," he said. "Your briefing on the Geneva Protocol has been circulating for months." I shifted the tray to a nearby table and took his hand. "Appreciate that, sir," I replied evenly. "Consider this an informal inspection." He smiled. "An effective one, it seems." Around us, silence gathered like a tide pulling in. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. My father found his voice again, rougher now. "Did you just say?" Agent Thomas turned toward him, still smiling. "Yes, Gregory. Your daughter here is overseeing the review for the federal authorization." My father blinked, then tried to recover, but the balance of the room had already tipped. He looked at me, seeing for the first time the badge clipped inside my clutch. His voice came out tight. "You're the one they sent?" I nodded. "Technically, I'm the one deciding if Monroe Dynamics moves forward with the contract, but tonight I'm just here to enjoy the event." I handed the tray off to a passing waiter, straightened my shoulders, and let the moment breathe. The silence stretched, then broke into murmurs. People whispered names, titles, theories. My father's complexion went from pale to flushed. Paula's hand tightened around her glass. Derek stared as though he'd misread the script. I stepped forward into the open space near the chandelier, the same place I'd stood years ago when he announced Derek as his heir. The lights felt warmer now, and I didn't lower my gaze. No one spoke to me for the rest of the night. The music resumed, but the tone had changed. Wherever I walked, conversations bent slightly curiosity, trailing behind me like a shadow. Some faces looked impressed, others looked unsettled, as if a rule had been broken. I found a spot near the fireplace and stood quietly watching my reflection in the glass. The firelight caught the edges of my dress and threw them into amber. In that moment, I wasn't the girl who left. I wasn't the outsider serving drinks. I was exactly where I needed to be, eye level with the family that had taught me everything about appearances and nothing about truth. My father didn't approach me again. Paula disappeared into a circle of guests, her laugh a little too loud. Derek stayed close to the model display, answering questions he barely heard. When the orchestra began packing up and the guests started drifting toward the doors, I slipped out through the side corridor. Rain had started again, soft against the windows, steady as breath. The valet offered me an umbrella. I shook my head and walked into the night. The estate lights glowed behind me, distant and unreal, as if I'd just stepped out of a photograph that finally stopped pretending. The next morning would bring the real work, the audit, the data, the accountability they never expected. But that night, standing in the rain, I realized the stage had already shifted. The family who once measured my worth in obedience had seen the one thing they couldn't control, and by the time they understood what it meant, it would be too late to change the story they'd started. By the time I left the estate that night, the rain had eased into a light mist, but my thoughts were heavier than the clouds. The quiet hum of the car's engine filled the drive back to the city. Streetlights blurred into ribbons of amber, and for the first time in years, I let the silence stay. My father's expression, shock frozen between disbelief and humiliation, played behind my eyes like a reel I couldn't shut off. There was a time I would have traded almost anything for his approval. Tonight proved I no longer needed it. Still underneath the calm, something raw pressed at the edges, an old bruise I'd learned to live around. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I brewed a pot of black coffee in my small apartment and sat by the window watching the city wake up. The file on my laptop glowed faintly against the gray light. Monroe Dynamics + Stonebridge Global Confidential Audit Authorization. My name sat at the top of the clearance page above my father's company seal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Before the day was over, I'd be walking through those same glass doors he once told me I'd never belong behind. Not as family, but as oversight. The drive to headquarters took an hour, most of it spent rehearsing the simple discipline of staying professional. When I reached the building, the guard at the gate scanned my badge, then straightened quickly. "Good morning, Agent Monroe," he said. I nodded. The air inside the lobby smelled like polished steel and lemon cleaner. The receptionist froze when I introduced myself for check-in. She stammered a greeting and called upstairs for clearance. I waited, hands folded over my laptop bag, pretending not to notice her eyes flicking between me and the company logo on the wall. The elevator ride felt endless. I stepped off on the 12th floor, the heartbeat of Monroe Dynamics, the systems and security wing. A young engineer with sandy hair waited nervously near the server room. "You must be Noah," I said, glancing at my notes. He nodded, eyes wide. "I didn't think you'd be coming in person." "Sometimes it's better to see things for yourself," I replied. His shoulders squared, and he led me into the control center. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each one streaming code and network data. The hum of servers filled the space, steady and low. I asked Noah to walk me through their endpoint containment and firewall segmentation. He started speaking quickly, his voice catching whenever he reached an incomplete section. I listened carefully, stopping him only when something didn't match the specifications I'd reviewed. "You didn't build this architecture from scratch, did you?" I asked. He hesitated before admitting, "No. Executive direction was to deploy pre-approved code from the prior model. Mr. Derrick wanted it ready before the partnership deadline." I let the words settle before writing them down. "So he skipped the last round of penetration testing." Noah's expression tightened. "Yes, ma'am. It wasn't my call." We moved deeper into the lab, stopping beside a console connected to the central node. "Show me the sandbox logs," I said. Noah typed quickly, pulling up the data. The timestamps looked off. Whole clusters of entries had been wiped clean. "Who had clearance to modify these?" I asked. He swallowed. "Only me and Sophia Diaz before she transferred." I jotted both names, then leaned closer to the screen. The pattern wasn't random. Someone had set an automated deletion trigger. Whether accidental or intentional, it broke compliance protocol. "Noah," I said quietly, "send me the full commit history for the last 4 weeks, and revoke executive override until further notice." His eyes widened. "That includes Mr. Derrick's credentials." "Yes," I said. "Follow protocol." Within 2 hours, I had enough to raise 3 major red flags. One vulnerability in the access pipeline could allow unmonitored entry within seconds. Another in the inspection layer could mask foreign traffic as internal. And the timestamp deletions meant there was no reliable traceability if a breach occurred. Each flaw on its own was serious. Together, they were catastrophic. I began assembling the preliminary report. Every keystroke echoed louder than the hum of the machines. I'd spent years in rooms like this chasing other people's mistakes. I never thought I'd be cataloging my own family's. The door hissed open behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Derrick's reflection appeared faintly in the glass-rolled sleeves' forced smile, the practiced calm of someone who's been briefed to stay composed. "So," he said, stepping closer, "you've made yourself comfortable." I kept typing. "You made it easy." He crossed his arms. "You locked me out of my own system. I followed federal audit protocol," I said evenly. "You would have known that if you'd read the compliance terms." He laughed softly. "Come on, Riley. You're not really going to destroy Dad's company over a few bugs." I stopped typing and turned. "This isn't about bugs. It's about a system you launched without final security validation directly connected to federal networks. That's negligence." He scoffed, but the edge in his voice gave him away. "You don't understand what it takes to run a company like this. Investors want speed, not delays. Investors don't manage national defense data," I replied. The silence between us thickened. "You think this is revenge," he said finally. "I think it's responsibility," I answered. "Something this company seems to have misplaced." His jaw tightened. I watched the color rise in his face, then fade. "You were always good at making me feel like the villain," he said. "You did that yourself," I replied quietly, turning back to the screen. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a report to finish." He lingered for a moment longer before leaving. The door clicked shut, and the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. I sat still, letting the quiet stretch until the hum of the servers filled it again. There was no satisfaction in it, only necessity. By noon, I'd sent the encrypted report to the liaison office under the tag Federal Audit, Level Omega. The next stage would be public a presentation with Stonebridge and Monroe Dynamics executives in the same room. Evidence, data, and decisions laid bare. When I finally left the lab that afternoon, the city sunlight felt harsh after hours under fluorescent light. My phone buzzed an incoming message from Thomas Keating's office confirming tomorrow's meeting at 9 sharp. I stood for a long moment on the sidewalk, watching the glass tower rise above me, sleek and cold. It was everything my father had wanted me to inherit. I wondered if he'd built it strong enough to survive the truth. Back home that evening, I spread my notes across the kitchen counter. Pages of data logs, compliance charts, and security snapshots lined up in neat rows. The evidence spoke plainly. I didn't need to add anything. My father's voice replayed in my mind from years ago, the day he told me I was making an expensive mistake. Back then, I thought he was talking about money. Now I understood he meant control. I looked around my small apartment at the worn blue couch and the hum of the refrigerator and felt an odd calm. This was the life I'd built on my own terms. Tomorrow would test every bit of that resolve. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on one by one. The rain had stopped completely. Somewhere downtown, I knew the executives of Monroe Dynamics were preparing their presentation, unaware that the real script had already changed. I closed my laptop and stood at the window, watching my reflection fade into the dark glass. The meeting would decide more than a contract. It would decide what this family stood for once the truth surfaced. I straightened the report on the counter, slid it into my briefcase, and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow morning, I'd walk back into Monroe Dynamics, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the one person in that building who still remembered what integrity sounded like. The next morning started before sunrise. Washington's skyline was still painted in soft gray when I buttoned my blazer and slipped my credentials into the inside pocket. The briefing folder in my bag felt heavier than paper should. By the time I pulled into the Monroe Dynamics parking lot, the city was awake, and every inch of glass on the building mirrored the pale light. A guard opened the door without a word. Word had spread fast since the party. I could feel it in the way people looked up from their desks, the way whispers flattened when I passed. Inside the conference wing, the air was too still, too polished. A long mahogany table stretched through the center, the kind that reflected everything except truth. Each chair had been aligned with military precision. Bottled water notepads, pens, nothing out of place. I set my briefcase at the far end where the federal seat marker waited and opened my laptop. The screen glowed against the wall of glass that overlooked the city. In its reflection, I saw myself calm, small, steady, exactly how I needed to be. Derek walked in 15 minutes late, trailed by 2 assistants balancing tablets. He gave me a practiced smile, the same one he used on investors. "Morning, Agent Monroe." He said each syllable stretched just enough to sound polite. I returned the greeting and went back to my notes. His voice lowered. "So, this is how it's going to be." "Professional," I said simply. "That's how it's going to be." Greg arrived next, suit, perfect expression, unreadable. He didn't speak when he saw me, only nodded once before taking his seat beside Derek. The last to enter was Thomas Keating. He carried the quiet authority of someone who never needed to prove it. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "Let's get started." His eyes met mine briefly, a silent cue that we were moving from courtesy to work. Derek began the presentation with smooth, rehearsed confidence. Slides flashed across the wall screen, timelines, growth charts, market projections. Every phrase was designed to impress, every pause meant for effect. But underneath the polish, I could hear the tremor in his tone. I recognized that sound, the quiver of a man aware the ground beneath him might shift. My father watched him proudly at first, then glanced toward me each time I made a note. When Derek finished, Thomas nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe." Then he turned to me. "Agent Monroe, you may proceed." I connected my laptop to the display and waited for the first slide to appear. The government seal filled the wall stark and silent. Over the past 48 hours, I began my team, and I completed a level Omega review of Monroe Dynamics' back-end infrastructure as part of the Stonebridge Partnership Assessment. The words sounded even practiced. We identified 3 Category Red vulnerabilities that compromise compliance and pose unacceptable risk to national systems. The room went still. I clicked the remote. Slide 1. An access pipeline highlighted in red showing a breach time of 14 seconds. Unrestricted data flow between sandbox and live interface, I said. Immediate exposure upon connection. Slide 2. Obsolete inspection filters with a failure rate over 60%. Slide 3. Log inconsistencies, timestamp deletions, eliminating forensic traceability. Any one of these issues, I continued, would disqualify a defense contractor. Combined, they indicate a failure in executive oversight. No one spoke. Even the projector seemed quieter. My father's knuckles whitened where his hands gripped the edge of the table. Derek's jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the floor. I let the numbers fill the silence. They didn't need translation. Furthermore, I added, clicking to the next slide, access logs show an executive override disabling safety protocols on April 3rd. The timestamp glowed under the company header D. Monroe. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This decision expedited deployment without penetration clearance, resulting in an unstable interface. Greg cleared his throat. Agent Monroe, he started, surely these are temporary issues, Ms. Monroe. I corrected gently, keeping my tone level. And the data is current. Derek stood abruptly, voice breaking through the silence. You're making this sound deliberate. I was trying to meet a deadline. That's what leadership looks like. I turned toward him. Leadership also means accountability, I said. You launched code that could expose defense networks to mid-level adversaries. Not a hypothetical, a measurable risk. Thomas set his pen down. I've reviewed Agent Monroe's work before, he said quietly. If she calls this a red-level breach, it's red. His tone left no space for argument. We'll follow her recommendations. Greg rose from his chair, the lines around his mouth deepening. Thomas, we can discuss this privately. Thomas shook his head. There's nothing to discuss. Until compliance is restored, Stonebridge cannot proceed. Agent Monroe's authority stands. The decision landed like a dropped stone. Papers shifted, chairs scraped back. Derek's face drained of color. Greg looked from him to me, realizing control had slipped from his hands, and there was no gesture grand enough to retrieve it. I closed my laptop. You'll receive the formal documentation within 24 hours, I said. The freeze takes effect immediately. When the others filed out, only the 3 of us remained, father, son, daughter. The air felt heavier without the noise. Greg finally spoke. You came back to humiliate us. His voice was low but hard. No, I said quietly. I came back to protect something bigger than us. He looked down at the polished table, the reflection of his hands trembling faintly in the gloss. You're this powerful, he said after a long pause, and you used it against your own family. I shook my head. I didn't come to be powerful, Dad. I came to do my job. Derek stared at me, a mix of anger and disbelief in his eyes. For a moment, I saw the boy who used to follow me around the yard before ambition turned into competition. You just destroyed everything, he said. Maybe I answered, but at least what's left will be honest. I left the conference room without waiting for another word. The hallway outside was quiet, only the soft hum of ventilation and the click of my heels breaking the silence. The glass walls reflected rows of empty offices, each one a fragment of the empire my father had built. I passed them all one by one until I reached the elevator. When the doors closed, the mirrored panel showed my face, tired, calm, unchanged. Outside, the air smelled of rain again. The clouds had thickened the city sky, dimming to silver. I crossed the parking lot slowly, letting the wind cool my hands. The job was far from finished. The formal report still needed signatures, reviews, recommendations. But the hardest part, the moment where truth met denial, had already happened. At the edge of the lot, I stopped beside my car and looked back at the tower. The logo on its side gleamed faintly through the mist. For a long time, I'd imagined what it would feel like to stand up to that building, to the name etched across its glass. Now that it had happened, there was no triumph, only the quiet certainty of balance restored. I got in, started the engine, and watched the wipers sweep a clean path through the rain. Tomorrow would bring the next phase, the private reckoning behind closed doors. But for now, the drive ahead was enough. The following morning, I returned to headquarters to finish what the meeting had started. The office was quiet, stripped of the usual buzz that filled its corridors. Security badges clicked against glass doors, and my own reflection followed me down the hall. Behind every pane was a department waiting for instruction, unsure whether to prepare for business as usual or brace for change. The report I'd filed overnight had already triggered a suspension of operations on the defense interface. For the first time since Monroe Dynamics opened, my father's company was under federal review. I stopped by the liaison suite, where Ellen Price was waiting. She was composed as ever, hair pinned, neatly eyes steady behind reading glasses. "Your documentation is clean," she said, sliding a marked copy across the table. "They won't find room to question it." I nodded, closing the folder. "What happens next?" Ellen leaned back in her chair. "Stonebridge will finalize the freeze within 72 hours. After that, Monroe Dynamics must restructure oversight and appoint a new project lead before any reinstatement." She paused. "You're not staying for that transition, are you?" "No," I said. "My work ends with the report." She studied me for a moment. "It's harder when the names in your file are people you know." Her tone wasn't judgment, just understanding. I folded the file into my briefcase and stood. "I've learned to separate the work from the history," I said quietly. She gave a small nod. "That's a skill not everyone manages." When I left her office, the conversation lingered like the hum of fluorescent lights, steady, necessary, a reminder that duty and peace rarely share the same space. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had rolled in thick and low over the city. I parked outside the estate without quite planning to. The rain had stopped, but the air smelled of it. Through the tall windows, I could see movement in the front parlor, Paula setting out 2 glasses of wine, my father seated across from her. For a long moment I stayed in the car, hand resting on the wheel. Then I gathered my folder and went to the door. The housekeeper opened it, eyes flickering with recognition, before she stepped aside. "He's in the study," she said softly. I walked through the hallway past portraits that looked more like brand statements than family memories. The study door was half open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. My father looked up from his chair. Paula turned with a wine glass halfway to her lips. "Close the door," he said. His voice was calm but worn. For a while, none of us spoke. The clock on the mantel marked the silence. "You embarrassed me," my father said finally. "You could have handled this privately." I set the folder on the desk between us. "There was nothing private about the risks you approved. The oversight was public. The failures were documented." Paula's laugh was low, sharp around the edges. "Failures. Your brother worked day and night for that system. You don't destroy your own family's work and call it protection." I looked at her steadily. "You gave me conditions, not family. There's a difference." My father stood the motion, slow but deliberate. "You were the one who walked away Riley." "No," I said. "You pushed me out because I wouldn't fit your design." The air between us felt thick with years of unfinished arguments. He paced to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You think this makes you right? You think being the government's watchdog gives you the right to judge us?" "I don't have to judge you," I said quietly. "The data already did." Paula set down her glass with a sharp click. "You always had to prove something," she said. "You could never just be normal." I met her gaze. Normal meaning obedient. She stepped closer, her voice rising slightly. Meaning loyal. My father turned from the window. "Enough!" His tone carried authority even now. Then, softer, almost weary. "You were never meant to be my adversary." I moved closer to the desk, placing both hands flat against the wood. "I didn't come here to punish you," I said, "but I won't apologize for becoming someone you didn't expect." Paula stood rigid, her knuckles whitening around the stem of her glass. My father's expression softened for just a moment, enough for the edges of anger to fall away. "I never hated your intelligence," he said. "I hated how it made you unreachable." That admission hung in the air. For the first time since I'd walked in, the room felt smaller, almost human again. "You didn't lose me because I was unreachable," I said gently. "You lost me because you kept pulling the ladder up behind you." His eyes flicked toward the folder on the desk. "What happens now?" he asked. "You'll need a new project lead," I said. "Someone qualified, not convenient." Paula's head snapped up. "You want us to demote Derek? I want you to protect your legacy," I replied. "Right now, it's one misstep away from collapse." He exhaled the sound heavy. "And you?" "I'll file the final report, then transfer back to D.C." He nodded slowly. And after that, I looked at him, really looked at the man who'd built an empire of circuits and walls and still hadn't figured out how to build a bridge. After that, I said, I'll do what I've always done, the work. When I stepped outside, the daylight had started to fade. The rain had returned thin and silver soft against the gravel. I walked to the car, but before I could open the door, I heard footsteps behind me. Derek's voice cut through the mist. Running back to D.C. already, I turned. He stood without a jacket, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes shadowed, but steady. "I'm not running anywhere," I said, "but I'm done here." He leaned against the car beside mine, exhaling hard. "So that's it. You blow everything up and just drive away." I looked at him. "No, I did my job." He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "You really think I never tried?" That stopped me. "Tried what?" "To live up to him," he said. "To be what he wanted." His laugh was thin, almost bitter. "Every mistake I made, every time I hesitated, he'd remind me how perfect you were, even after you left." I blinked. That's not how it looked from where I stood. He shook his head. "Of course not. You were out there building a career. I was in here trying not to fail before I even started." The rain deepened. Drops ran down his face, but he didn't move. "Are you going to report me for the override?" he asked quietly. "The report already includes it," I said. "But I didn't call for a criminal referral, just replacement and oversight." His shoulders eased slightly. "I'm not here to destroy you, Derek," I added, "but I won't protect your shortcuts either." He studied me for a long time, then nodded. "Then maybe it's time I stopped taking them." I opened my car door. "Don't waste the second chance," I said. "You won't get another." He didn't follow me or argue. He just stood there, arms crossed, the rain softening around him. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who'd finally stopped pretending. As I drove away, the estate lights disappeared behind the curve of the road. The city stretched ahead, bright and distant. The windshield wipers kept time with the thoughts I didn't speak. Tomorrow would bring a new call, a new assignment, another system to fix. But tonight, the only thing that mattered was the quiet between each mile. The kind of quiet that comes when everything false has finally fallen away, and what's left, however small, is real. The flight back to D.C. was short, the kind of quiet trip where time feels suspended. I didn't think about the meeting, or my father's silence, or even Derek's expression in the rain. I kept my thoughts small, focused on the hum of the engine and the faint reflection of city lights flickering in the cabin window. When the plane landed, I moved through the terminal unnoticed, another traveler returning home with too much left unsaid. By the next afternoon, my desk was stacked with new files, different projects, different crises waiting for order. Work had a way of anchoring me, and for a while, I let it. But somewhere under the routine, I knew something had shifted. The past wasn't tugging anymore. It had finally released its hold. That realization came quietly, like a door clicking shut behind you. 3 days later, I received a message from Thomas Keating's office. A private meeting, 5 o'clock, M Street headquarters. No context, just a date and a time. When I arrived, the city was slipping into evening, the sidewalks glowing with a wet sheen from an afternoon shower. The receptionist led me to a glass-walled suite overlooking the Potomac. Thomas sat by the window jacket off tie, loosened a teapot instead of coffee on the table between us. He stood when I entered. "Thank you for coming, Riley." I set my bag down, unsure why I'd been called. "Your assistant said this was confidential," I said. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. "Always, but this one especially." He poured 2 cups of tea, steam curling in the light. "Do you remember your first published paper?" The one on decentralized response firewalls. The question pulled a memory from years back, long nights in graduate housing coding through exhaustion. The paper that never made it to a conference but somehow reached the right inboxes. I remember I said, "It was the start of everything." Thomas smiled faintly. "I read it twice. Do you know why I shook my head? Because it wasn't written to impress," he said. "It was written to protect." His tone carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades recognizing the difference. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's why I requested your assignment for the Monroe audit. When I saw that company's name on the partnership list, I knew the conflict would be personal. I also knew you'd handle it without flinching." The admission startled me. "You requested me?" "Yes," he said simply. "I told the board to send the one person who didn't owe anyone in that building a favor. I needed someone who'd make decisions the data could stand behind." He paused, studying my face. And I wasn't wrong. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city beyond the glass was bathed in amber light, the river stretching dark and still below. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "It cost you something, but it was right." I let out a slow breath, not sure if it was relief or fatigue. "What happens now?" I asked. "The federal office will review your recommendations and assign implementation," he said. "You won't need to oversee the transition. Someone else will step in." He hesitated, then added, "But I wanted you to know your name came up for something else, something larger." He slid a thin folder across the table. The seal on the corner was one I recognized: Homeland Infrastructure Task Group. "We're expanding the initiative for national encryption standards," he said. "I'd like you to lead part of it." The offer landed quietly but firmly. It wasn't flattery, and it wasn't coincidence. "Take time to decide," he added. "You've earned that right." When I stood to leave, Thomas extended his hand. "You didn't come back for revenge?" he said, his voice low. "That's why it worked." I nodded once, then stepped into the hallway. The air outside felt lighter, cleaner, the way it does after rain. I didn't know yet if I'd take the offer, but for the first time in years, every choice ahead was mine alone. That night, I returned to my apartment and unpacked my small travel bag. 2 suits, a folder of notes, the same worn laptop. The space was modest but peaceful: wood floors, shelves lined with books, a balcony overlooking Georgetown rooftops. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the city lights shimmer in the damp air. They didn't demand attention. They just glowed, steady and sure. It felt right that way. 4 days passed. The final report was signed, the audit officially closed. On the 5th day, I deleted the last message from my father's number, a voicemail that started with authority and ended in silence. No apology, no anger, just a pause long enough to feel like surrender. I let it go. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. That evening I made dinner the way I liked it: fresh pasta, basil, a glass of red wine. The music was low, the kind that filled the air without taking it over. Halfway through the meal, someone knocked on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a young woman stood there, maybe early 20s, holding a manila folder to her chest. Her ID badge caught the light: DC Cybersecurity Fellowship. She looked nervous but determined. "Agent Monroe?" she asked. I smiled gently. "Technically, yes, but it's just Riley here." She flushed a little. "Sorry, I was told to deliver this to you personally." She handed me the folder. I invited her inside to get out of the cold. She perched on the edge of the couch while I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter, crisp and official. "We would be honored if you would serve as a lead mentor and program designer for the National Youth Encryption Initiative." I read it twice. Then I looked up at her. "Is this real?" She nodded quickly. "I read your Geneva report. It's the reason I applied for the fellowship. People like me, women from small schools, we didn't think we belonged here until we saw your name." Something in her words reached me deeper than I expected. She stood to leave, adjusting her glasses. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, "for making it easier for the rest of us." I walked her to the door. Next time I told her, "Don't thank me, just pass it forward." She smiled, nodded, and disappeared into the hallway. When the door closed, I returned to the table, the untouched pasta cooling beside my glass. I didn't need to finish it. The room already felt full. Outside, the city's lights blinked softly against the clouds. I sat down again and opened my journal. On a clean page, I wrote 8 words that came without effort. I did not come back for them. I came back for myself. Then I set the pen down and watched the ink dry, slow and certain, like an ending that finally knew its place. The night settled quietly around me. Somewhere below, a siren faded into distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of traffic on wet streets. Tomorrow would bring another day, another decision, but this one would start without fear. For the first time, I wasn't looking backward. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 2 weeks later, the city had settled into early spring. The air felt lighter, and for once my days didn't start with crisis briefings or encrypted messages waiting before dawn. The final audit report had been filed, the committee acknowledged the findings, and Monroe Dynamics was in quiet reconstruction. From what I heard, Derek had stayed on working closely with an outside security firm to rebuild the system from the ground up. I didn't reach out, and he didn't call, but there was peace in that distance. I spent most mornings at the fellowship office, now a sunlit space, in a renovated brick building near DuPont Circle. The first training sessions were small. A handful of students like Maya, eager-focused, a little unsure of their place, but determined to learn. Watching them reminded me of my own start back when I was just another name on a clearance list, hoping my work would matter. The difference was, these young engineers would never have to question if they belonged. The door would already be open for them. One afternoon, I stayed late reviewing proposals for the Youth Encryption Initiative. Outside the window, the streetlights had come on, washing the sidewalks in soft gold. My phone buzzed an unfamiliar number, but local. I hesitated before answering. Agent Monroe. The voice was quiet, cautious. "It's Derek." For a moment I couldn't speak. "I didn't expect to hear from you," I said finally. "I know," he replied. There's something you should see. Not about the company, not official. It's personal." He sent an address in Arlington near the old research park where Monroe Dynamics had started decades ago. The message ended with a single line, "Dad's there tonight." I almost didn't go. The part of me that had spent years learning boundaries knew better. But something about Derek's tone stayed with me. So just after dusk, I drove across the river, the headlights cutting through the rain that had started to fall again. The old facility sat back from the road, the Monroe logo still faint on its gate. Inside, the security lights glowed over an empty parking lot. Derek waited near the entrance, hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked tired, but different, less rehearsed, more grounded. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He nodded toward the building. "He's inside. Has been all day. I think you should talk to him." I followed him through the corridor, the air heavy with the smell of old concrete and dust. My father was in the main lab, sitting at a long table covered with blueprints and dismantled hardware. He looked up when we entered. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his expression quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. "Riley," he said, standing slowly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I didn't plan to," I said. Derek called. He nodded, gesturing toward the table. "Do you remember this place? You used to sit right there while I worked. You'd draw on the backs of my diagrams, little circuits that made no sense." I looked around. The walls were the same dull gray, the equipment older now, edges worn from years of use. "It's where I learned what a firewall was," I said. He smiled faintly. "You always asked the right questions. I just didn't know how to answer them." The silence stretched between us. Derek stayed by the door, giving us space, but close enough to listen. My father reached for one of the blueprints. "When your audit came through," he said, "I thought it was punishment, a way to hurt me for pushing you out. But I've been reviewing the systems myself, and you were right. We'd been building fast, not careful. We thought we were leading innovation, but we were cutting corners to stay relevant. You didn't destroy this company, you forced it to survive." His words carried no defense, only fatigue and honesty. I didn't know what to say. "You don't owe me an explanation," I said. "It's done." He shook his head. "Maybe not. I can't change what I said years ago, but I can admit that I was wrong." His voice caught slightly. "I told myself I was building a legacy. I just never thought that legacy might be you." Derek looked down, and for the first time in a long while, I saw him not as the rival my father had shaped, but as another child who'd been trying to win the same impossible approval. "She saved us," he said quietly, "even if it didn't look that way." My father's eyes met mine again. "You both did," he said, "in different ways." The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming softly against the high windows. My father reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, the original encryption framework, he said, placing it on the table. "Your design." I kept it. I stared at it, the silver catching the light. "You used to say it was naive," I said, "that it would never scale. I was wrong about that too." He smiled, a real one this time, tired but true. "I want it protected properly. Maybe you'll know what to do with it." I took the drive, closing my hand around it. The metal felt warm from his touch. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. "I'm stepping down after the reconstruction. The board knows. Derek will take the lead under oversight. It's time." There was nothing grand in the moment, no applause or sudden reconciliation, just quiet understanding, settling where conflict used to live. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it's simply the absence of bitterness. When I left the building, the rain had thinned to a soft drizzle. Derek followed me out to the parking lot. "You think he meant that he asked?" "I think he's trying," I said. "And that's more than I expected." He nodded, looking toward the faint glow of the city beyond the trees. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm going to make the company right this time. Not for him, for the people who trust it." I believed him. We stood there for a while, listening to the sound of rain on metal. When he finally left, I sat in my car watching the building fade into shadow. The flash drive rested on the passenger seat, a small, unassuming thing that carried years of unfinished stories. I thought of the path that had brought me here, the girl with questions, the daughter disowned, the agent who came back not for revenge, but for truth. By the time I started the engine, the storm had passed completely. The road ahead gleamed under the streetlights, clean and quiet. Tomorrow the world would go on. Systems would be patched, networks rebuilt, students mentored. But tonight, for the first time, everything felt balanced. As I crossed the bridge back into the city, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Not the agent, not the outsider, just Riley. And for the first time, that was enough. The next morning, I would open the encrypted file my father had given me. But before that, I drove home in silence, letting the rain wash away the last of the noise. When I woke the next morning, sunlight poured through the thin curtains, and for once, there was no rush to check messages or reports. The apartment was still warm with the scent of rain that had drifted in overnight. On the table sat the flash drive my father had given me, small and unassuming, yet heavy with everything that had come before it. I made coffee, pulled my laptop closer, and slid the drive into place. The screen came to life with a single folder titled Monroe Legacy. Inside were notes, sketches, and fragments of an unfinished program, my original encryption model from years ago, restored line by line in his handwriting. He'd renamed the last file Riley V2. I opened it slowly, watching the code scroll across the screen. The architecture was cleaner now, the corrections careful. He hadn't just saved my design, he'd completed it. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about understanding. For a long time, I sat there in silence, reading each comment he'd left in the margins. "You were right about the framework. This line was ahead of its time. Wish I'd listened sooner." Every word carried the weight of apology and respect, quiet but enough. When I reached the end, the last note appeared in plain text. "For my daughter, may she always build what others only imagine." I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the morning light fall across the room. For years, I'd measured success by how far I could distance myself from what hurt me. But sitting there, I realized that healing isn't distance, it's recognition. You can't rewrite the past, but you can decide how much of it you carry forward. Later that afternoon, I met Maya at the fellowship office. She was reviewing a set of security proposals, her glasses sliding down her nose as she typed. "You look like someone who hasn't slept," she teased. "Too much code?" I smiled. "Something like that." I told her about the old framework, about how technology ages but ideas don't. She listened intently, nodding. "Are you going to share it with the team?" she asked. I thought about it. "Maybe not yet," I said. "Some work is meant to teach us before it teaches others." As evening settled, I walked home through the quiet streets. The air smelled of spring-wet brick, blooming trees, the faint trace of rain. The world moved on as it always does, unaware of how much can change in silence. In the weeks that followed, I sent my father a brief note. Nothing dramatic, just words that felt honest. "Thank you for the file. It meant more than you know." His reply arrived a week later. "Proud of you. Always have been, just took me too long to say it." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but something gentler, a mutual pause, an understanding that not every bridge needs to look the same once rebuilt. Derek sent an update too. The company had implemented every safeguard I'd recommended. He'd stepped into leadership with a new team and a smaller ego. He didn't ask for approval, and I didn't offer it. We'd found a better kind of balance, the kind that doesn't depend on being right. One evening, near the end of that spring, the fellowship hosted its first showcase. Students presented encryption tools they'd designed for community safety programs. Watching them speak, voices trembling at first, then steady with purpose, I felt something quiet shift inside me. The future didn't need to start from scratch. It only needed a few open doors. When the event ended, I stood by the window of the hall looking out at the city lights. They shimmered softly against the river the same way they had on that night after the audit, only now the view felt different. Peace has a shape, I thought. Sometimes it's as simple as a clean desk, a message answered, a bridge repaired enough to cross once more. I walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights. The rhythm of my steps matched the calm beat of everything finally in place. Life would go on, new projects, new people, new choices, but the noise that once filled every space had finally quieted. I had returned to where I began, not to reclaim a name or a legacy, but to remember who I was before I needed either. Some stories don't end with applause or headlines. They end with quiet mornings, steady work, and the peace of knowing you stood your ground when it mattered most. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself piece by piece or walk back into a room that once shut you out, I hope this story stays with you. And if it does, share it with someone who might need to hear that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes.